Bueno, es un gusto para mí presentar a un colega y un amigo como Alessio, que hoy nos visita acá y que, bueno, a lo mejor muchos de ustedes lo conocieron como profesor de la UNAM, pero bueno, ahora ya está en Bélgica. Bueno, Alessio se formó en Pisa, en Italia, y luego realizó su doctorado en la Universidad de París, trabajando en teoría de control, y entre 2012 y 2015 realizó estancias postdoctorales en Liège, donde ahora está como investigador, y en la Universidad de Cambridge, en Inglaterra. Entre 2015 y 2022 fue profesor acá de la Facultad de Ciencias de la UNAM, donde todavía sigue en cierta forma colaborando y estricto para mantener colaboraciones, graduar estudiantes y mantener intercambios, así que si alguien lo quiere aprovechar estaría bueno. Y desde hace un año es profesor en el Departamento de Ciencias de la Computación en la Universidad de Liège. Desde su comienzo, su trabajo ha sido muy interdisciplinario, con un foco principal en teoría de control y principios computacionales necesarios para entender y diseñar comportamientos biológicos y bioinspirados. En particular, ha trabajado en principios regulatorios, ritmo, excitabilidad neuronal, un poco de lo que nos va a hablar hoy, desde neuronas hasta estados cerebrales, y también en toma de decisiones. Actualmente, bueno, mantiene una amplia gama de colaboradores, donde en particular, o al menos para mí, se destaca mucho la colaboración que mantiene con Naomi Leonard de Princeton, donde han trabajado mucho en teoría de control, en redes, en toma de decisiones, en robótica, y creo que si a alguien le interesa un poco las aplicaciones que hoy en día hay en neurociencia y tecnología, vale la pena mucho checar. Pues hoy nos hablará un poco de cómo diseñar herramientas que permiten modelar y entender la cognición y aplicarlo a circuitos artificiales. Y bueno, y desde mi vista luego de visitar el grupo en Bélgica, considero que es un gran lugar, un lugar ideal para muchos, para establecer ya sea irse a hacer un posgrado o establecer colaboraciones a primer nivel mundial, neurociencia, tecnología e ingeniería. Así que, Alessio, muchísimas gracias por venir a visitarnos otra vez a México y pues adelante.
Muchísimas gracias, Román. No, es un mega placer, ando medio emocionado de dar esta charla aquí, de regresar a esta universidad que ha sido mi casa académica por muchos años, y de la cual la decisión de irme a Bélgica estuvo bastante complicada, pero se abrió una ventana de oportunidades de las cuales le voy a hablar también hoy, que la verdad no pudo, estuvo difícil no tomarla. Pero como decía Román, mi objetivo es seguir fortaleciendo las conexiones que ya hay entre Liège y la UNAM y aprovechar de mi tiempo allá para que estas colaboraciones, estos vínculos se vuelvan todavía más fuertes. Entonces, antes de comenzar con la parte más científica de la charla, le quería justo platicar un poquito de lo que hacemos allá en Liège, no solamente yo, sino también mis colaboradores y colegas con los cuales estamos creando este laboratorio que se llama Laboratorio de Ingeniería Neuromórfica o de Neuroingeniería. Los nombres cambian. Entonces, este laboratorio es un laboratorio extremadamente interdisciplinario, donde se juntan cuatro campos fundamentales de la ingeniería. Uno es el diseño de chip y de sistemas electrónicos, entonces la parte más hardware. Hay una parte robótica donde tenemos bastante infraestructura de muy alta calidad. Y algo que estamos armando ahora es, por primera vez en el Departamento de Ingeniería de la Universidad de Liège, va a haber una parte de biología, y en particular estamos armando un sistema que se llama Brain on Chip, desarrollado por IMEC, que está en Leuven. Entonces, IMEC es la empresa que inventó, que diseñó los neuropíxeles, por quien lo conoce, y los neuropíxeles realmente son electrodos basados en tecnología CMOS, entonces la misma con la cual se hacen los transistores, y gracias a esto lograron hacer electrodos que son extremadamente chiquitos, extremadamente pequeños, en particular que lograron llegar exactamente a la escala celular. Y gracias a esto se pueden tener registros súper detallados de la actividad celular. Los neuropíxeles que el laboratorio de Román ya adquirió también son lineales, entonces son para hacer registros en vivo en corteza principalmente, Mientras que el brain on chip es un arreglo plano de electrodos sobre el cual se pueden hacer cultivos celulares, desarrollar órganos en vitro y todo lo que se puede a nivel de cultivos. Y bueno, todo esto está acompañado claramente por una parte más, digamos, más clásica, donde se hace machine learning en un sentido un poquito más, más computacional también. Y bueno, la idea es que estos cuatro campos van a estar en interacción constante para intentar que haya intercambio lo más posible entre los varios ámbitos y la filosofía, la base de este laboratorio es que el objetivo principal es entender la inteligencia, qué es la inteligencia, qué es, cómo funciona, de dónde, cómo se desarrolló. Y para hacer esto, la idea es estudiar biología, pero también implementar lo que entendemos de la biología en máquinas y esencialmente ver lo que funciona o que no funciona, con un anda y reanda constante. Entonces, estos son los componentes de este laboratorio. Entonces, hay Jean-Michel Redouté, que es electrónico del grupo, Guillaume, que es la persona más relacionada a Machine Learning, Pierre, que es el más robótico, y yo, que estoy en la parte más de teoría de control, modelado y en parte robótica, me estoy metiendo, y Kevin, que es un postdoc, que es la persona que está desarrollando el brain on chip gracias a la colaboración con INEC. Les quiero solamente platicar de lo que Jean-Michel ya tiene en su laboratorio. Entonces, Jean-Michel Redouté es el jefe del laboratorio que ya existía, que se llama Microsys, donde esencialmente tienen equipo de muy alta tecnología para hacer diseño de sistemas a nivel del micrómetro, a nivel microscópico. Y en particular se pueden hacer packaging de chips electrónicos y también desarrollos de microfluídica, desarrollo de materiales como elastómeros que necesitan diseño a nivel nanométrico. Y todo esto esencialmente nos permitirá también desarrollar sistemas robóticos, actuadores y sensores inspirados en la biología directamente in situ. ¿Okay? Bueno, no le voy a dar su presentación, pero este laboratorio tiene varios años y tiene equipo muy grande y va a ser parte del laboratorio de ingeniería neuromórfica junto con el brain on chip, la parte robótica y la parte de machine learning. Esto para decir que los caminos que tenemos son varios, y solamente, el límite es solamente la creatividad, esencialmente lo que podemos hacer en este laboratorio. Efectivamente, el laboratorio está creciendo mucho, en particular, bueno, los ideadores fueron Guillaume y Pierre en el 2019, como que juntaron sus grupos para empezar a crear la neuroingeniería a Liège. Jean-Michel joined, maybe I switch to English, sorry. So Jean-Michel joined the lab with his facilities in 2021. Then in 2022, I arrived, and then Kevin just started this year. And at the moment, if you count PhD students, postdocs, and PIs, we are a group of 20 people and growing. At the level of funding, we are in a very good position at the moment. Maybe it won't last forever, but at the moment, we definitely have the funds and the possibility of developing many things, and also hiring PhD students and bringing people in and out of this lab. And the main funders are the Belgian government, essentially, and the Well Research Institute, which is a research institute of the French-speaking part of Belgium. Just to tell you a little bit the project, so the 4 PhD students I'm supervising at the moment in this group. So my group is called Embodied Excitability because, as you will see, excitability is a key concept in my research. Not surprisingly, if you do neuroscience, excitability should be there. And embodied is because I'm trying to bring excitability into robotics and into brain-inspired robotics in a purely analog and dynamical system fashion. And so I have the 4 PhD students supervising are Luis, who is the chip designer, and in particular, he already sent his first electronic neuromorphic neuron to production. His objective is to have a neuromorphic neuron, so built with CMOS transistor and standard 180 nanometer technology, a neuron that is capable of being modulated between mostly tonic sparking and bursting, but something that can exhibit some flexible behavior in terms of excitability, as we know it happens in the brain. And this is something that was not neuromorphic engineering before Luis' PhD. Neuromorphic engineering is all the branch of engineering that tries to reproduce the mechanism of the brain into electronic chips with the goal of going beyond digital technology, and this with the objective of using less power and being more flexible and adaptive as biology is. Then Christian, he's doing his project is based. He's not using chips, but he's using neuromorphic controllers, in the sense that a controller that's made of neuron, and in particular neuron that can be modulated in various ways. And his goal is to use neuromodular neuron to activate rhythmic mechanical systems, like it would be the legs of a robot. Then there are Fatemeh, or Kimia, as she preferred to be called, who arrived from Iran in January right now, and her project leads with event-based visions. So I don't have time to talk about event-based cameras, but if you don't know what they are, if you look for event-based camera or dynamic vision sensor, you will see that they are aware of not using frames to perceive the visual world, and this brings a lot of advantages. And her project is building neuromorphic layers to filter essentially the output of an event-based camera. And then Rodrigo, who was with me and basically joined me in Liège, he's using the notion of motor synergy, and in particular designing controller that can use motor synergy to achieve adaptive sensory motor control. So using decision making in the synergy space. Okay, so that said, I think we can start with the actual talk. I think that the main this talk, I hope you won't find it too trivial or too naive. But the question of this talk is essentially why spikes? So why is biological intelligence based on excitable events? So this question, of course, has been posed a number of times in neuroscience, and the fact that spikes are at the basics of cognition is kind of evident if you do neuroscience, and even if you do biology, we find something like spikes and excitable events also at the molecular level in cells that are not neurons. The spikes are very preserved, at least in system with a neuronal system. So you find spikes in C. elegans, you find spikes in humans, in rats. So as soon as you open a nervous system and you poke an electrode in it, you will find something that looks like a spike and that correlates with the behavior of the animal. We know a lot about how spikes are generated. So the physiology of spiking is very, very well known. I don't have to tell this in front of this audience. But the biophysics of spiking is basically a solved problem. There is nothing more to understand in terms of how spikes arise from the electrical properties of cells. But at the same time, if we go to trying to understand cognition, we are still very, very far from understanding why spikes and how spikes are used for cognition in the real world. So something that for me is key if you want to understand the role of spikes is embodiment. The fact that are very natural, are very for intelligence when there is an interaction between sensors and actuators in a way that must be fast and flexible, like it happens for sensory motor behaviors in animals. So the various theory that try to justify spikes have different flavors, but my impression is that all of these theories essentially lead to a dead end. So they provide an answer that was very partial, and eventually they didn't really help us understanding why spikes are used in the first place. So physicists, probably back in the 80s or 90s, started to think that spikes create kind of a binary code. So the fact that we have this analog machine that use electricity and resistors and current to function, but they also have these events. And so these events, the idea was that they create units. And so that basically they create a way of representing things in biology. Another reason for which spike, another answer for which spike might have arisen is essentially an evolutionary constraint. So as animals became bigger and bigger, then spikes became necessary to connect the two ends of a neuron, of an animal. And all these answers are summarized in this beautiful book from Samuel Lauflinger, and who's in Cambridge, and Peter Sterling, that I don't remember where he is. Anyway, another possibility for justifying spike is that, still coming from evolution, is that spikes essentially save energy. So because spikes are transmitted only when they are generated, so it's a very sparse in time way of communicating, then maybe this sparse way of representing information and do computation essentially could have led animals to save energy instead of using more continuous type of signal to do computation. Something that's quite clear is that if we want to have some form of plasticity, spikes are basically necessary. So for everything that potentiation and depression of synapses, if a spike, it's very difficult to have something that will adapt and then we learn something. Although, yeah, we are discovering more mechanisms of adaptation and learning that do not really involve spike. But in the classical view, at least we need spike to have plasticity. So the point of the talk I would like to make is that if we look from a more theoretical perspective at the question of why spike, and when I say theoretical, is really from an engineering perspective, from a functioning perspective, so not theoretical in the sense of computer science or mathematics, but really something that must work in the real world. My proposal is that spikes essentially are the natural outcome if you want a system that can make decisions and can make decisions adaptively in the real world. So this is the naive slide. I hope you won't laugh at me, but I mean, just a spike is a decision. Okay, a spike is there or not, and if you have a neuron and inject some input in the neuron, if the input is close to the threshold for generating a spike, well, the neuron really has two options. It either decides to generate a spike or it doesn't. So when I say neuron decides, of course, I'm not giving any type of agency to the neuron. I don't think that, I don't mean that there is some kind of will inside the neuron, but from a functional perspective, if you look at it from outside, we can look at the neuron as a system that's making a decision each time it generates a spike. Why is this point of view useful? So, okay, but before going there, so if you take C. elegans, for instance, then the sensory motor behavior of C. elegans, you don't really have sodium spike in C. elegans, but you still have calcium spike and other type of excitable behavior. So essentially, in something as simple as C. elegans, essentially you have sensory spikes, then you have spikes at the motor level, and a transition or a transmission from sensory decision. So, for instance, is something being perceived or not, to an internal layer that maybe has some memory, has some adaptation in terms of processing what's being perceived, and eventually this decision leads to a motor action. For instance, should I go back? Should I move forward, or should I move backward? And so it's, I don't know, if you think about your experience daily, I have the impression that there is really not much more going on than perceiving something and making the motor action in response, so making motor decision in response of what's being perceived. And even perception is something very, very decision-like. So when you say I perceive something, there is always a question, am I perceiving something or not? And so although the first layers can have some kind of analog processing, then very rapidly, the secondary sensory cortices already have a very categorical type of representing sensory information, meaning that very early on in the sensory system, perception becomes something that is kind of a decision. Did I perceive something? Am I perceiving something or not? And okay, and for motor action is the same. I mean, either you do a movement, either you choose to use a word, or you choose to go left or right, or you don't. And so when we look at sensory motor behavior and the nervous system implementing them, essentially as decision maker, then I have the impression that spikes are very natural, and I will try to convince you of the same. So I would like just to review a couple of papers that I find very inspiring and useful for putting some more concrete ideas behind what I'm saying. The first one is from Rodney Douglas, who is also one of the main founders of neuromorphic engineering, besides being a neuroscientist. And in this paper, basically, he makes the point that spikes create a spatiotemporal decision-making representation. Sorry. And the key point of his idea are the just-in-time and just enough principle. So just-in-time means that we need something that can be localized in time, something that have a notion of precision in time. And okay, a spike is exactly something that marks a point in time at which something is happening. Then if you take interacting neurons that interact with spikes, well, essentially each time two spikes meet at a postsynaptic neuron, this creates a branch in the spiking space, because the postsynaptic neuron can decide to spike or not. And as these decisions are made, a path is created in the configuration of essentially of the cortex of any other neuronal system. And the important point in his theory is that this spiking behavior must be synchronized with the external world. That this notion of time and event do not really make sense if you live in a cloud, if you are not flowing in the physical time. So I read this again as that spikes are something that must be embodied to really understand their functioning and their behavior. And this, of course, goes against a lot of computational neuroscience, not against, but the standard approach is kind of much more disembodied, much more algorithmic or computational to understand the role of spike. But my impression is that if you really want to do it, then we have to study systems that are embodied. And I mean, the experiments that are done here are sensory, although they study representation of sensory information, decision making in rather abstract parts of the cortex. They need the sensory motor behavior to exist in the first place. You cannot train an animal without letting the animal perceive something and do an action in response. Okay, so all neuroscience relies on embodiment, and probably so do spike. This is just another pointer to why spike must be useful. That is, in this paper, essentially what is proposed is that thanks to the coincidence detection nature of spikes, a network which is highly correlated, highly non-efficient from an information theoretical perspective, like the cortex, could actually use this lack of optimality, this lack of efficiency to create more robust behavior, essentially using the timing and the coincidence detection of spiking. And these are two other two recent papers that essentially in experiments and in models are basically rediscovering what Douglas suggested almost 20 years ago. There is not much more. I have the impression that thanks to things like neuropixels, there will be more and more about the role of single spikes and to be able to measure multi-unit activity, single neurons simultaneously, which until now has been very hard to be done. But yeah, we will see what will come out. Let's go to the theory. So now I will switch from neuroscience to equations, which are my favorite object. What I will tell you is basically the convergence of two projects that have been bringing on from 10 more years ago. So one is understanding fast and flexible decision making in biology and reproducing it in models and in machine. And this is something that on which I've been collaborating a lot with Naomi Leonard in Princeton. And then even before with Rodolphe and Guillaume, who now is one of the colleagues I showed you before, we try to understand excitability and neuromodulation from a control theoretical perspective. So understanding the feedback principles underlying excitability. And essentially what I will present is the convergence of these two projects. What I will argue is essentially excitability is basically the necessary dynamical behavior. We have no escape. You cannot make decision in a ever-changing environment in succession without using excitability. This kind of event-based, this almost digital, discrete kind of switchy nature of spike is what's needed for this decision making to be fast, as needed in the real world. And at the same time, the analog nature of spikes is fundamental for flexibility. Yeah.
I'm just curious to hear. Let me ask the question in the following way. You consider classical mechanics. You will never consider the subatomic nature of matter. But you don't need to know that in order for these laws to apply for the macrocosmos, right?
Yes.
So I won't argue that the spikes are part of the function of the neuron. That's something that is unobservable. But the question is whether that measurement for the level that you want to analyze, which is behavior, that includes many different neurons and many other parts of the body, if that is something that is really important, that you cannot find some other observable, like in the mechanical classical physics, that will help you to model in a simpler way.
So my thesis is that when I say spikes are not necessarily neuronal spikes. So spikes in the sense of trajectory of a system. So that each time we make something that looks like a decision, essentially what we are doing is a spike, essentially. And that's inevitable. That's something that if you want to represent through dynamical system, the process of making decision and then keep on perceiving the environment and then make other decision, then there is no way out of spikes. And then, okay, neurons are a type of realization of spikes, but they're not the only one, of course. Yeah, so that's the point. And what I'm suggesting is that this is essentially substrate independent. It does not really matter whether it's realized in ion channels or it's realized in CMOS transistors, essentially, or if it's realized in molecular signaling networks. In all cases, if you have something that's an analog machine, and despite being analog, must make these kind of discrete choices all the time, then there is no way out of spiking. That's the point.
That's what I was saying, that we cannot argue against the idea that there are subatomic particles. There are, by all means. The question is, we do need for modeling.
Why are you mentioning some subatomic particles?
I'm making an analogy.
I don't see the analogy.
The size of small events that happen in every neuron.
They're not small. They want to be large.
Well, it depends on your perspective of the scale, right?
Yeah. So
for a movement of a muscle,
yeah,
the size are small, like atomic particles.
Yeah.
Right. But what you are measuring is the movement, and you want to find a way to model that based on some basis. And my question is, if spikes are really necessary for such, for modeling such broad phenomena?
My thesis is yes. Of course, it's almost a guiding principle, but yeah, I mean, maybe with some equation, it will start to be clearer. So the way in which you kind of arrive at spikes. So what I will do is not imposing spikes, but essentially arrive at spikes just by imposing a series of behavioral constraints on a system that makes decisions. Yeah, so this decision-making perspective, which is very in line with Douglas and this recent paper from Panzeri, essentially provides a whole new bunch of way of studying coding through spikes that goes beyond rate-based modeling, essentially. Okay, the two tools I use are control theory and bifurcation theory, mostly because they are nice way of looking at equations without being overly technical. Okay, so everything I will tell you is can scale up to very large network, but I will make the point because I'm already kind of late. I will make the point on the simplest equation that can implement decision making in an analog system. So in a differential equation, and this is the system. So x dot is the derivative of x with respect to time. What is x? Well, x can be understood as the opinion of this system, and in particular, if x is positive, then this system is committed to option 1. If x is negative, then this system is committed to option 2. And if x is 0 or close to 0, then this system is undecided or neutral. So the different terms of the system are, first of all, we have a negative feedback term given by that essentially creates an exponential decay that creates a fading memory in the system. Then we have a feedback, another feedback term. So feedback meaning that x is influenced by itself, and because 10h is a monotonically increasing function, this term provides positive feedback of x on itself. And then because we want this system to be able to perceive the external world, then we have a last term which are the input to the system. And so it is very easy to see that when u is larger than d, when u is smaller than d, then this system has only one equilibrium for b equal to 0, which is at the origin. Whereas when u is increased, so when the positive feedback is cranked up, this system passes from being monostable to be bistable because now there are two equilibria. Why all of this is relevant for decision making? Well, okay, first of all, what happens when u is equal to d is called the bifurcation, because you have the equilibria at the origin that loses stability and bifurcate into three equilibria. And usually bifurcation, when you look at them from a feedback perspective, always happens when you have a balance of positive and negative feedback. So this feedback can be tuned in a biological setting. And when you have a balance between the stabilizing effect of negative feedback and the destabilizing effect of positive feedback, then you have a bifurcation. When positive feedback dominates, the system behaves very nonlinearly. So when U is large enough, you have this bistable system with, so bistability is an intrinsically highly nonlinear type of behavior. Whereas when the positive feedback is small and negative feedback dominates, then the system is monostable. And although you have some nonlinearity, it basically behave in a linear fashion. So bifurcation are the way of switching between something that looks something like a very linear kind of smooth type of behavior and something that starts to look more like a digital behavior, like a switch when positive feedback dominates. And everything I'm saying can very neatly represented in a bifurcation diagram. So this is the bifurcation diagram of the system when B is equal to 0 and U star is equal to D. And so these lines mean that for U smaller than U star, you have a unique equilibrium at the origin and it is stable. When U is large enough, the origin becomes unstable and you have two new stable equilibria that appear in a pitch for bifurcation. And so this branch here is what we can associate to a neutral opinion state. And these two branches that appear at the pitchfork is what we can associate to decision state 1, decision state 2. And if you now have input added to your system, if the input is positive, then basically this bifurcation diagram break up in a way that reflects the input. In particular, if B is positive, then only the branch associated to the decision state 1, the one that the system is likely to take. We can also represent the behavior of the system by using B as the bifurcation diagram, the bifurcation parameter instead of U. So now we have kind of an input-output map for the system. And in particular, when U is smaller than U star, the input-output map is monotone and mostly linear. So the response of X to input is not very sensitive and it's linear. When U increases, the response of X to B become hysteretic. So now you have something that looks like a digital switch between the decision state 1 and decision state 2. Because of hysteresis, now you also have memory, because these two attractors can retain the information of B, although B has disappeared. And that's all. An important part of bifurcations is also that at bifurcation, the system is ultra sensitive. So because at bifurcation, you have a linearization which is singular, so the eigenvalue of the linearization at a bifurcation is 0. This means that the linear system at a bifurcation has an infinite input-output gain. And this is fundamental because when you are close to bifurcation, then even a very tiny B can completely change the decision-making behavior. And this is key when you want to make decisions that are fast, although you have very, very weak information. You are not really, so the sensory input are very noisy and the actual information can be very low. And the idea is that thanks to bifurcation, the little information you have is enough to make a very sharp decision. And this is 100% thanks to the ultra sensitivity brought by bifurcations. Then past bifurcation, you have what is called deadlock breaking. So imagine you have zero information, but still you have to make a decision. Because if you don't make a decision, maybe you will hurt yourself or you will start or you will enter dangerous zone. So this has been studied a lot in honeybees more than neurons. And so they make a lot of experiments with honeybees in a situation in which the hive in which they are is depleting. So they must make a decision to where build the new hive. And the experiment they make were very controlled in such a way that the two options the scouting bee were finding were more or less exactly of the same quality. And so essentially you have half of the honeybee population which prefers nest 1, hive 1, or location 1, and the other half which prefer hive 2. And so the population must make a decision, otherwise essentially the whole colony will die. And if you model this behavior, what people have found is exactly that the mean field representation of the honeybee community can exactly be represented as a pitchfork bifurcation, in which when the time pressure is too high, despite not having evidence for either option, the situation in which the population is indecisive become unstable, and the whole population is able to make a democratic and consensus decision for one of the two options. Why is it important to have this tunability? Well, because when you are in the linear regime, then the system is very robust to input and to disturbances because of the linear characteristic and because of negative feedback. Whereas when you are in the bistable regime, then because these two equilibria are exponentially stable, so they are actual attractor of the system, in this state, the system is able to maintain decision robustly. And so by tuning the positive feedback gain, you can switch essentially from a robust linear behavior corresponding to neutrality, because maybe you don't want to make a decision, you want to wait for more information to come, to a state in which you can make robust decision in a switchy way. A problem of this model, and I will go very fast now, is that although you have these two behavior, what is lacking is a situation in which you have neutral behavior, stable neutral behavior coexisting with decision behavior. So why is this important? Well, because we would like a system that for small inputs, so for small information that's being received, remain robustly close to neutral, waiting for more information to come, essentially. But as information increases, as input increases, then we would like a system that is also able to detect this arrival of information and essentially switch to the decision-making type of behavior. And a system in which this notion of small, large information can essentially be tunable to something that can be maybe adapted or learned through time, something that's not fixed. So that this threshold for large and small and also the sensitivity to input is something that we would like to be able to tune arbitrarily. So just to have a graphical representation of this, we would like a system for small inputs remain close to neutral, but as input, the strength of input increases, is able to switch to the decision state, or so essentially to increase this U variable in such a way that a decision can be made once inputs are large enough. And so the idea of achieving this is exactly translating into a question what I'm describing. And so in particular, having this variable U, this parameter U, not being a parameter anymore, but being a variable, and in particular being a variable driven by the magnitude of the opinion. Why is this? Well, because if some inputs arrive, then X will increase, either up or down, and by increasing, X, its square will increase, and so this will make this variable U increase as well, and so bring the system closer and closer to the decision-making bifurcation. And so let me skip the phase plane. I prefer to just use the bifurcation diagram. So if you now draw the bifurcation diagram of the system when this variable U is driven by opinion, now what you have is again a pitchfork bifurcation, but now the pitchfork bifurcation is what's called subcritical. And in particular, now you have a region in which the stable neutral state coexists with the two stable decision states. And when inputs are increasing, then you break this pitchfork and you make a decision very rapidly towards the option favored by the input. And if you look at the input-output characteristic of the system, when you have this state-dependent tweaking up of this parameter U, now you have a much richer input-output characteristic, and in particular at the extreme of this line. So for either very small basal U0, so basal positive feedback strength, or for very large, so for very small basal positive feedback strength, you have something that's again essentially linear. For very large basal positive feedback strength, you are back to the switchy decision-making behavior. But now between, you have a whole region in which, as a function of input, the system can remain either in the linear neutral range, or if input are large enough, it can switch to a decision state. And this input-output characteristic is very soft, it's very flexible. It's not something that's coded in the system, because by, again, tuning the strength of the positive feedback, you can more or less smoothly deform this input-output characteristic between something that's kind of not very sensitive to input, so in a case in which you really need strong input to switch to the decision state, to something that can also, for not too large input, can make a decision rapidly, okay? And so again, if you imagine yourself making a decision that has a deadline, you might start in this situation, so you accumulate information, and you're not really sensitive to what's going on, but as time passes, you become more and more sensitive to input in such a way that when the deadline arrives, you can make a decision and not just remain undecided. So there is another problem of this model until now, is that if we take the model as it is, once the decision is made, it's made. It's impossible to go back to the neutral state. So the question is, once the decision is made, how do I go back to the decision state? Any idea? Through a spike, essentially. So once the decision is made, so once the system is switched to a decision, if there is some feedback mechanism that bring the system back down to the neutral state, then when you look at this trajectory, what you have is exactly something that looks like an action potential. And so this is basically the main theoretical part to justify my answer, that if you accept that decision correspond to bifurcations in a dynamical system, then once the bifurcation has passed and the decision is made, you must have something that brings the state of the system back to its basal state in such a way that input can be integrated again, and eventually new decision be made either toward the same option, or if the input has switched, maybe toward the other option. So okay, a way of representing of achieving this in this system is by adding a slow negative feedback term. So this is really taking what we know about spikes in neuron and translating it in a decision-making model. So we know that the spike is the fast positive feedback given by sodium usually, and then the slow negative feedback given by potassium. And so basically this model is doing the same. There is fast positive feedback term, which is the way in which this variable u on x in order to make decision, and then a slow negative feedback term essentially brings everything back down to its nominal state. And so just to give you an animation, something interactive of how this could be used in a robotic setting. So this is the simulation of a model in which this agent, the blue one, is just a unicycle model. So essentially, it's just a model that goes straight with constant speed. It can decide whether to steer left or right. And the control input is the strength of steering left and right. And by implementing the equation that I showed you before, the agent is able to perceive, for instance, the approach of an incoming object. And when the object is close enough, it will make spikes towards steering left. And once the obstacle is passed, can start to make spike in order to track the target and try to follow it. So as you see, now you have spikes that goes up and down. We know that in neurons, this is completely unreal. Spikes are only one dimension, in one direction, always up. But this is a model that's inspired from neuronal spike, but it's just a generalization, essentially, of excitability in a setting in which you can make spike in different directions, where each direction is one decision that you are making, and then forgetting it, and then make new decisions. The idea is that if you don't have excitability, so if you have a controller that makes a decision and then is stuck, then what you get is something that can kind of become compatible, get stuck in a decision in such a way that the agent can kind of, instead of just avoiding the obstacle, remain stuck in the decision to steer left in this case, and do a whole loop, which eventually will lead to colliding with the obstacle. So okay, the takeaway, I think it's very simple, and I hope when I was making, not to say something too naive, is basically this, so that spikes emerge naturally simply by imposing that a decision is forgot and made impossible to happen again. If you get rid of the excitable nature, then basically you get a decision-making behavior which is either or too slow or too stiff or not flexible enough, or that can kind of get stuck in decision. So that if you take away any of the few ingredients I added to my model, that is fast positive feedback, fast negative feedback, state dependent, strength of positive feedback, and slow negative feedback. So these four elements, which are very general, they are not dependent on any type of biophysical realization. If you take away any of them, then essentially it's something that doesn't work as it should from a behavioral perspective. And that's okay. The fact that it's not a digital model of decision making allows for this flexibility through tuning bifurcation thresholds. Okay, so I consider this kind of a mental exercise, but I really hope that it can also be used to understand better how single neurons work. So what's the role of single neuron in a sensory motor or perceptual decision making process, like what we are collaborating with Rowan. So okay, again, if you are a neuroscientist, you might say, yeah, but up and down spikes have never been observed in nature, but you can see this up and down spike essentially as a model reduction, for instance, of a neural circuit, where up spike correspond to spikes on neuron 1 and down spikes correspond to spikes on neuron 2. And so essentially, instead of having two neurons that mutually inhibits each other in such a way that when option 1 is chosen, option 2 is not chosen, vice versa. You can see this as something that, okay, you just take two neurons and merge them in a single decision-making node. And this is how this multidimensional spike can be used to model also neuronal circuits. The advantage of this is that that model is much more easily analyzed and maybe fit to data than having neurons interacting with each other. And it's also easier to implement it in electronic circuit. Yeah, you save transistor, you save power, and so on and so forth. Okay, this is how you can generalize this to an arbitrary number of agents making decisions and making decision about an arbitrary large number of options. These are just the questions. I can assure you that they can be studied. And this is just to give you an example of what we can understand as a network spice, and this maybe is going toward also answering the question that was asked. So this is a network of agents that's perceiving input and making a decision between option 1 and option 2, and so collectively they make a decision toward option 1. But then because of slow negative feedback, they go back to the resting state. And this can happen at any scale. It's not something that it can be cellular, it can be network, it can be population-wise, and so on and so forth. So something very important for, I think, for this audience is that essentially a spike is also the natural way of describing working memory. So the way in which you can store a decision, which can be perceptual or else, for a while and then forgetting it when it's not used anymore. So if you look at traces of working memory, essentially what you see is something that switches to a state and then goes down. And that is the collective activity of thousands of neurons, of course, averaged in time and in space. And okay, the nice thing is that you can also have not only agreement decision, but also what's not working? Also disagreement decision or disagreement spikes, in which some neuron fires towards right and some neuron fires toward left. And then this is kept for a while in memory and then got such a way that the network can make new decisions. And so basically what I'm proposing is this kind of generalized notion of excitability in which spikes can happen in a multidimensional space. And in terms of application are basically the one that I mentioned before, so neuromorphic chip. Try to go forward in trying to use these ideas to understand population dynamics as well. And then decision making for sensory motor control in artificial systems. And potentially, this is her thesis, using this notion of generalized decision in order to filter events from an event-based camera and have essentially a perceptual decision-making layer downstream this camera. And that's all for my part. These are a little bit of references. And I don't think there is time for questions, but if there are questions, I will be happy to continue also later. And thanks a lot for the attention.
I'm curious to know the model that you're proposing for how to activate and then go back to the initial state. How that compares with the attention module in deep learning. The attention is more or less the same idea. So give the neuron to retain some information in the neuron, but some of it will be lost, right? So that's why when you were explaining your model, I was thinking perhaps if you have already tested in learning tasks.
We are in the process of. So the idea, I think that the attention model is in transformers, right? So of which I barely know anything, but I know that this model exists and it allows essentially to retain part of the information and disregard the other. What we are doing is using all of this in standard recurrent neural networks. So the idea is that we want to stick to analog type of behavior. And so in machine learning, what we are doing is using these ideas both to trying to dissect the dynamics of a recurrent neural network that has learned something, or try to kind of modify or use these insights to tweak the network in such a way that learning becomes more efficient and more robust. My impression is that, I mean, my impression is that they're rediscovering l'acqua calda, they're rediscovering hot water, in the sense that they're re-implementing all of these mechanisms that are already in biology, but calling them in different ways. Yeah, that's just an opinion, essentially. Yeah.
Alessio, ¿cuánto han implementado de todo esto con Naomi?
Bastante, es decir, hay un estudiante de Naomi que está usando este modelito que he mostrado del unicycle, lo está usando para hacer interacción humano-robot. Entonces, tener un agente, un robot que usa estas dinámicas para decidir cómo moverse alrededor de humanos que le van a encontrar. Y también otro estudiante, no de Naomi, pero todavía en el mismo departamento de Mechanical Aerospace Engineering in Princeton, is using the same idea for actually coupling these to a more standard neural network approach. Also having a controller for a self-driving car that use a mix of standard learning, but with on top some decision-making dynamics that allow the controller to be much more reactive and fast when the car encounters situations of things that have not been learned previously. And on my side in Liège, basically Christian is using this for adaptive rhythmic control. So he's built a neuromorphic drummer, we hold it, which is basically a pendulum with a drumstick and the neuromorphic control that can control this pendulum to achieve a desired tempo and a desired volume, velocity for the rhythm. And then you will use the same idea for soft legs actuation, which will be his actual PhD project. And Rodrigo is using this idea to make decision in this synergy space. So the fact that that we are over-actuated, we have many more actuators than degree of freedom, and so muscle co-activates in a group of synergies. And so the idea is now you have a low-dimensional decision space, which is the activation of synergies, and a high-dimensional space, which is the body. And so the idea is using this flexible dynamic to make decision in the low-dimensional space in order to achieve adaptive locomotion in the high-dimensional space. And all of this, of course, is just starting. And then Loris is kind of, for the moment, he's trusting the fact that this is useful for intelligence and is implementing all of this in chips without a specific application in mind, but just having analog, extremely low power CMOS designs that implement this kind of dynamics. There was a question.
¿Cómo se generaliza esto para que no nada más una decisión de dos opciones, sino a más? Porque pues, en general pues, quieres que no sea un escalamiento lineal en cuanto a la cantidad de opciones, pero no me imagino aquí cómo...
Esencialmente es una versión multidimensional de una pitchfork. Entonces, en lugar de tener dos ramas en una dimensión, vas a tener NO ramas en dimensión NO-1. Entonces, en general necesitas, para tomar decisiones como bifurcación sobre N opciones, necesitas un sistema dinámico de dimensión NO-1.
Pero el tiempo de la decisión igual no es que se escale linealmente.
No. Esto es totalmente independiente por la ultrasensitividad, esencialmente. Es una vez que estás cerca de la bifurcación, de que tienes un poco de input, básicamente regresas a una bifurcación en una dimensión en la dirección dada por los inputs. Entonces, todas las otras dimensiones esencialmente sí, desaparecen de la dinámica. Después, si estás muy cerca de la bifurcación, las cosas pueden ser también muy lentas, porque el valor propio es cero. Entonces, cuánto eres rápido depende mucho de cuánto estás cerca de la bifurcación y de cuánto los inputs son fuertes. Pero, sí. Todo esto es implícito, digo, tal vez en robótica, implementar todo esto en digital permite ser mucho más cuantitativos con estas escalas temporales, thresholds y todo. Aquí todo es implícito, sabemos que estas escalas existen, que estos umbrales existen, y el hecho de ser analógico es lo que permite esencialmente tener comportamientos ricos, comportamientos que no sean predeterminados por un algoritmo, sino que emergan de la interacción entre un sistema dinámico que es el agente y el otro sistema dinámico que es el ambiente. Entonces, dejar que las cosas surjan en lugar de preencodarlas.
¿Cuántas espigas
son necesarias para que ustedes puedan modelar si se toma la decisión o no?
Pues, creo que mucho depende del embodiment. Es decir, por ejemplo, en el caso de la gente que da vuelta, que puede decidir si dar una vuelta a derecha o a izquierda, esencialmente mucho depende de cuánto es fuerte la acción de un spike sobre el comportamiento motor. Entonces, creo que en general esta pregunta depende justo de cómo estas espigas se encarnan en un comportamiento. Pero si quitamos el comportamiento, no creo que la pregunta sea bien definida.
Por ejemplo, si hay conductas, dos neuronas que estén una disparando y la otra tratando de inhibir esa respuesta, ¿cómo modelar cuál gana? ¿Qué neurona es la que va a disparar o cuál es la que, o si no dispara?
No dispara. El punto de los potenciales, de tener potenciales de acción es que o hay o no hay. Entonces no hay que, de alguna manera, automáticamente dan una manera de representar si una decisión fue tomada o no. Y bueno, ahí lo importante es que las dos neuronas estén en mutua inhibición, de tal manera que solamente una puede disparar al mismo tiempo. Pero esto es bastante, digamos, motivos de inhibición mutua se encuentran en todos lados. En los que conozco mejor, los generadores centrales de patrón. En el córtex, el papel de inhibición está surgiendo como algo súper importante. Y esto, sí, puede dar como pistas por eso también, sí.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Bueno, aprovecho también para decir que a los chicos que están en la licenciatura y demás, que vieron un poco la importancia de estudiar sistema dinámico, machine learning y demás, para todo lo que va relacionado con neurociencia y ingeniería y demás. Si tienen alguna duda, bueno, pregúntenle a Alessio. Así que bueno, eso creo que va a ser un poco la neurociencia de los próximos años, para dónde se va a unir neurociencia con robótica, con control y machine learning y redes. Así que bueno, muchísimas gracias,
A
Alessio,
ustedes.
y ojalá te veamos pronto por acá.
Bueno, entonces la próxima semana estaré aquí, entonces si alguien quiere también reunirnos para discutir lo que sea, estaré acá.